Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji saibo zagyo jinhanya haramita jishoken gon Gai gudo esai gu yaku shari jishiki furi gu furi.
So for today's talk, we're going to be looking at some of the stories connected with Master Daiyu Myokyo, otherwise known as Myokyo-ni, who died in 2007. And the reason for this is that the month of March is in fact the memorial of her death on the 29th of this month, and it's obviously 9 years since her death. And so it seemed like a good time perhaps to reflect on a few of these stories and anecdotes that she used to tell. And just to give a little bit of background, in fact, Myokyo-ni was Austrian by birth and spent 12 years training in Daitokuji training monastery as a lay person between 1960 and 1972. In 72 she came back to the UK, where she helped set up the current Zen group that's based at the Buddhist Society and has 2 temples, one in London, one in Luton, and really devoted the rest of her life till she was well into her 80s, spreading the Dharma and really making the Dharma accessible for those who were interested. And obviously that was in the Rinzai Zen tradition, which was the tradition in which she trained. But one of the problems that she had was making the translation between Japan and Europe, because this problem that we have is that Buddhism, to begin with, is an Oriental religion. It doesn't come from the European mind at all. It doesn't come from our historical background, from our mindset. And in fact, we have our own native religion. And that does mean that we have a lot of preconceptions about what is religion and what isn't religion as well. And this is often reflected when people talk about Buddhism not being a religion at all, but being a philosophy or a way of life, and so on. Yet actually, if you talk to people in native Buddhist countries, they would be quite surprised to hear Buddhism being referred to as irreligious or non-religious anyway, or secular or something like that. So the important thing was being able to take the understanding that she had come to through her own training experiences out in Japan, and being able to translate them into something that the hearers here could actually understand. And another big point that she was very keen to make to all her students, anyone who came to listen to her, was that the practice of Buddhism is something that takes place in the midst of one's own daily life. And therefore she was at pains to use examples from her own daily life, both present and past, going right the way back to her own childhood, to show that what Buddhism has to say is perennial. It speaks to the human heart, and that although the forms that the human heart take are different, mindsets and so on, and understandings and perceptions, these things do change and are different. The heart itself, which is the source of all these things, the source of understanding, and of course the source of the Buddha's wisdom and compassion, these things are universal, and they're not different, whether it's from past to present, or from east to west, or north to south, or male to female, black to white, and so on. And this is incredibly important because Buddhism is, in that sense, very much a universal religion. It speaks to the commonality. It speaks to the human heart, suffering and the way out of suffering. This is what the Buddha taught, and suffering is something that we, of course, can all relate to. So, always very keen to use her own life. As was explained before, she herself was an Austrian national. She came from a very rural part of southeast Austria, and she always described that area very rural as it was, as being stuck 300 years in the past. And by this she meant not in some kind of Luddite or backward-looking way, but that it had a very close affinity to its own traditions that had grown up in that soil, and that it had a connection to the soil, to the land, to nature anyway. And that this was something that was very well understood. And she gave one or two interesting examples because, as she said, people in her day, people didn't know about things like psychology and so forth, or so on, as people now tend to be a bit more savvy about that sort of thing. But she said that despite that, people had a sort of an understanding, an innate wisdom, being close to nature, weren't afraid of it, didn't feel separate or apart from it, which she was often at pains to point out in our spiritual ice age, as she called it, which she described the present as being something that we suffered from. And she said that the ambulances in her day, when she was a girl, were as busy taking people home to die as it was taking people to hospital to be cured. And she said it wasn't unknown either that somebody at a certain time of life would suddenly get the impetus to put all their affairs in order and sort everything out. And then 6 months later they would be dead. And there was that sense that, something was impending, something was coming. It wasn't frightening. People knew about it and could see it happening, and people had the whiff of it as well in themselves, and so were just instinctively prepared for it. And it was that sense of the instincts which could be trusted, which she often felt was lost with us now, that we were far too cerebral, too intellectualized, wanting to understand things. And this is typical of she would say. I want to control and manipulate. I want to understand, rather than being able to give myself into that deeper wisdom that arises from the fathomless heart. So that was one little example as well. And she said, curiously, again, when she was young on a Sunday, it was and still is a very religious country, deeply Catholic, or what she used to call pagan Catholic. And by that pagan, she meant, again, that paganus, being of the country, having that sense of nature and living in the midst of it, and along with the traditions as well, which reflect that, causes suffering. And she gave the example when she was a young girl of an example of this fear, that for some reason when she was very young, she had a terror of breaking a bone, because she imagined that it must be excruciating, and she felt that she would not be able to bear it. And then one day the inevitable happened. She had a fall, and she broke her leg, and looking up, she saw that her leg was literally bent at right angles. And rather than sort of the shock of the horror of what had happened, the first thought, she said, that came into her mind was, but it doesn't hurt. And this was, again, something that really stuck with her, made her realize that how she imagined things, particularly a passionately fired up imagination, has a tendency to overblow, to over-egg, to inflate things, and that our perception becomes skewed when we are under the influence of the strong passions. And, of course, not only that, but that those judgments that we make, those inflated judgments that I make all the time with that inner video, tend to fill me up, so that the space becomes full, and the heart mirror cannot reflect things properly. And again, she gave the example that when she was very young, there was a family crisis, and her her father, who was the head of the family, called everybody together, cousins, aunties, and so forth, and they all congregated at the family house and sat around the dining room table. And of course the children were in the room, but they were sitting at the back. It was the adults at the table. And the father opened and they talked about it and gave his view, and one by one everybody round that table gave their view. And of course the children, and Myokyo-ni was a child at that time, they were all on the edge of their seats because they knew this was a very important matter. And she said the fascinating thing was it got to the last person, and then her father spoke again, and once again it all went around the table, everybody giving a second view. And she said her jaw dropped because it was so obvious that no one had listened to a single word that anyone else had said. Everyone simply trotted out the same thing that they'd said the first time. And this also made a very deep impression on her. And this is something that we do in the practice of Buddhism. We observe carefully. We look to see, because if we are investigating the nature of the human heart, to see things as they really are, which is, after all, what enlightenment is about, then it means we have to pay very close attention to how we are and how others are as well. And that way we learn a lot, just instinctually, and we can begin to see it in ourselves too. So these were a couple of things when she was very young there. But she always said that, in fact, her first spiritual teacher, her first Zen master, in fact, wasn't the one at the monastery in Kyoto, but was in fact her old geology professor when she went to university in Graz. And she said he was a very slim, wiry man, energetic, and with a capacity for wisdom too. Just a lot of, that sort of perennial wisdom that some people seem to have quite naturally. And one day he came in to the lecture hall, and he picked up the board ruler, and then in the other hand a piece of chalk, and he drew a straight line across the blackboard. And then he turned to the students and said, "Now," he said, "if I was to ask you whether or not that is a straight line, the chances are that half of you would say yes it is, and the other half would say no it isn't, and we would fall into a right merry debate, and probably get quite heated about it, and who knows, may even come to blows over it." And then he, with that board ruler, he held it up against that straight line, and then he looked at them and he said, "And that is all we really need to do to settle the matter." And there's a wonderful story in the Pali Canon that really reflects that exact same point, though maybe not with straight lines. And it was with regard to the Buddha when he was passing through a certain town, and there was a group of people there who were called the Kalamas. And the Kalamas lived in a region where a lot of spiritual teachers used to pass through. And when the Buddha said that we began to speak to them, they asked him, they said, "Well, you're a spiritual teacher, and we've had a spiritual teacher last week, and that spiritual teacher said, now you believe what I tell you, not what the last fellow told you. But the problem was that the last fellow, he said exactly the same thing, as did the one before him, and now you come here to preach us the Dharma. So who are we to believe, and how are we to know who tells the truth and who doesn't?" And the Buddha replied, "It is proper, Kalamas, that you should not just believe something because you're told about it. You should not just believe it because it's tradition. You shouldn't just accept it because it's the fashion to accept a certain point of view. You shouldn't believe it because you like the sound of it, or that it appeals to you in some way. The only way that you can know whether something is true or false is to try it out for yourselves. And in that trying it out, if you find that it is conducive to good living and conducive to peace at heart, then you know it is the Dharma, and then continue practicing it. But if it is not, if it leads to disruption and trouble and more suffering, then leave it alone. This is the way that you know. And elsewhere, he said that, making the same point, he said that you should not just accept my teachings on face value just because you like me or you like them, but you should test them as the goldsmith tests gold by burning and rubbing. So you too should test the Dharma. And this is tremendously important for us because remarkably, although we are very scientifically minded and sort of post-enlightenment minded, it's remarkable how quickly we make up our minds about things, often without trying them. Things that we don't like, we want to test. But things that we are fond of, points of view or convictions that I have about myself, then these are things that I tend to just accept, never really question them at all. And yet they're not necessarily true. I remember when I was a young boy, I also didn't live in a city, I used to live in a seaside town. And with my brother, who was 4 years older than me, used to like to go fishing with his friends during the summer holidays. And my mother used to insist that he take his younger brother, that was me, along with him, in order to look after me, which of course he didn't want to do particularly. But he had no choice, and so we used to go out. I used to go with him fishing, and I used to get the rotten job of baiting the hooks with these rather unpleasant mussels. And these aren't the nice mussels that you get in the restaurant that have been steamed, especially. These have been sitting in the fishing tackle shop under hot lights and had definitely passed their best. But that seems to be how the fish like them. And so I got to bait the hooks. And so having spent a morning baiting the hooks, it came to lunchtime. I washed my hands in the sea. I took out my sandwiches and lifted that sandwich to take a bite out of it. And with my fingers waving underneath my nose, all I could smell were these rancid mussels. And I have to say that they made a very deep impression, not a good one either. And from that day, I couldn't look a mussel in the face. I certainly couldn't put one in my mouth or contemplate eating it. And then, of course, came the 1980s, and mussels became popular. They were appearing on the menus all over the place. And so whenever I was sat at a table and somebody ate mussels, I would trot out the story I've just told you. And then in the late 90s, I went out for dinner with a friend of mine who was actually moving abroad. And lo and behold, he had mussels for his starter. And they arrived, and I trotted out that story. And then suddenly, and I've no idea what it was, but the idea just sprung into my mind. And I said, may I just try one? Just see if they are still completely repulsive to me. And he said, yes, of course. So I stuck one on a fork and put it in my mouth and chewed it. And whilst I can honestly say that it wasn't the greatest thing that I'd ever eaten, it was okay. It was okay. So there too, that's also made a deep impression on me, because I was convinced I would not be able to swallow a mussel down, chew it without heaving, and maybe even throwing up. And yet, actually, the body was fine with it. So there was this disconnect between what I thought I could do, what I thought I liked, and actually the body's own preferences. And this is something that we discover, particularly in difficult circumstances. I'm often convinced that I can't do something. I'm often convinced that something would be too much. Just be too much of a strain, or would be too painful, and it would be too frightening. And yet, actually, if circumstances give us no option, and we find ourselves having to do it, it may not be pleasant always, but more often than not, and I think it's probably in 95% of the time, it's not as bad as I had actually imagined it to be. And there is that real fired up imagination again that we suffer from. And of course, the reason that we suffer from that fired up imagination, or the source of it, not the reason maybe, the reason is I, but the source of it are those powerful passions, what are known in Buddhism as the three fires of greed and hatred and delusion. And of course we share that great emotional power because we're mammals, along with our other mammalian brothers and sisters. And Myokyo-ni was also a great horsewoman. She rode horses from quite an early age and had a love of them all her life. And she learnt riding with a very traditional riding instructor, and she said it was that there were some wonderful lessons to be learnt for the Zen training as well with that, particularly when it comes to discipline, how we react to discipline, because she said horses are rather similar as well. And there's one exercise that takes place indoors, usually in a large square, and the horses are all on very long reins, and they've got the young riders on the back, and the riders have to take the horse into each of the four corners, and in the centre the instructor's there with a very long whip which is just cracked behind the back of the rider, if rider and horse are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. And she said you often had it that the horses would take a particular corner that they didn't want to go into, and the way it usually went was that the horse would go into the first corner and would go into the second corner, and coming up to the third corner you could feel the horse resist, wanting to cut the corner, and the rider's skill has to take the horse right into that corner, and you just managed to do it. And then the fourth corner, there would be the resistance, and the temptation would be for the rider to say, okay, well, just this once, it's okay, we'll cut the corner. And if the instructor isn't looking, because there's several horses on the go, you can get away with it. And then you come to the first corner, and the horse goes back into that, and the second, and the third. But when you come back to that same corner, of course, the horse got away with it the last time. And so now the horse is not going to go in. And no matter what you do as the rider, that horse will not go in. And then, of course, the instructor sees it, and that crack happens behind your back. And that little surprise, just that shock, sends that horse and rider both into that fourth corner. And she said this is the common thing that she used to find when she was at Daitokuji, training there. She said people didn't come up and sort of say, oh, please, would you do it like this? Or if you slammed a door or whatever, please don't slam the doors. No, what you would have is that the door would slam behind you, and suddenly there'd be a shout. And it goes right through the body. And the next time you went through the door, just as the door was about to slam, suddenly something would come up in the body, and the hand would shoot out and grab hold of the door, stopping it slamming. And she said you could do it, you could ask somebody 100 times before they would remember not to slam the door, but with that which goes right into the body. It may sound a little bit sort of, well, I don't know, cruel, not cruel exactly, but a little bit, I'm not sure about that. But she said it is so quick, it works so quickly and so directly. Anything that goes into the body, all in one go, that really makes the difference. That is something that is learnt very, very quickly indeed. So she was full of these little stories of training, and how the ordinary, commonplace things form very much part of our spiritual training and our spiritual landscape. But really, I'd just like to finish this talk by relating my own experience of when she was dying. the last 9 months of her life. She was pretty much bedridden. She had suffered a fall and was pretty much bedridden, and began to withdraw somewhat. But rather, as we said at the beginning of this talk, she also was. She knew she was dying, and she needed to put her own house in order. And she made sure that she did, that everything was sorted out to her satisfaction. And the last time I saw her, which was only a couple of weeks before she died, I remember I was up there saying my goodbyes along with a few others, and we knew that this would be the last time that we saw each other. And I remember her saying to me, first of all, she asked me, "Do you have any questions that you want to ask?" And I said no. Everything had been sorted out that we needed to for the time being. And then she said, okay, she said, "But you know, these forms," she said, pointing to our two bodies, "these forms, they come and go, but life, that goes on." And that was more or less the last thing that she actually said to me. And it's a curious thing, because it could almost be taken two ways. You know, we say, oh, well, things come and go, don't they? But life must go on. But that wasn't how she said it at all, not in that sort of resigned way, but actually in a way that pointed to that life with a capital L. Not this little life. This little life doesn't go on. But life with that capital L, that does go on. She used to talk about that life. She said it was not something that you could separate out from forms, from living beings. You cannot separate life from living beings, yet we all know what life is. Rather, and she used to use the analogy of the body of a wine, that when we talk about the body of a wine, we know what we're talking about, but you cannot separate that quality from an individual glass of wine or an individual bottle of wine itself. And so it is with life as well. Life in itself is something quite mysterious. It's something that we can see clearly, and certainly when we see the dead. And I remember when I saw Myokyo-ni's dead body, she had an open coffin, and we sat vigil around it. The one thing that really struck me was the stillness. That animating principle was no longer there, that great life. And I remembered those words, that life goes on. Not that it goes anywhere. It simply transforms, and this is why in Zen, death, when somebody dies, it's often referred to as undergoing transformation. And that's what life does. It undergoes transformation. And she used to use an analogy for this. She said it's like electricity. She said electricity you cannot see. It flows through the wires, but you can put your finger on it. But when you put your finger on it and it gives you a shock, it's doing something. But if that same electricity goes through a bulb, then it produces light. If it goes through a coiled wire, it produces heat. If it goes into a motor, it produces work. And these are the three forms that electricity can usefully take for us. But electricity itself, what it is in its own essence, that we can never know. It's invisible, but clearly it's there, and clearly it has an effect. And so does life too. And this is really the great mystery. And that we tend to think of ourselves in terms of individual selves. We place great importance on these individual selves. But in the essence, these selves, these forms, they come and go. But the animating principle, what about that? And as she used to say, that energy, that dynamic quality, which is what I'm talking about when I talk about spirit, for example, the spirit of something. It's that animating principle, that which produces the effect. What's known in Buddhism as the inherent law, the Dharma in things, and the Buddha nature in living beings. This is the real mystery, but it's a mystery that is so close, that is actually in us too, and something therefore that we should never forget. we'll leave it there.
Boji so